linked with us Barak Richman, which is professor of law and business administration at Duke University. His areas of research are institutional economies, health law and policy, behavior economics and health policy, and economics of contracts, and so on. And we have with us Costanza Sciubba-Caniglia, special editor, commentaries of Harvard Kennedy School Misinformation Review, a title that is very important for our debate, and also director of Istituto di Geopolitica Digitale. With us there is also Alexia Massacand, founder of Mountain Now, the new platform for mountain safety. It has dealt with revising the European Commission's program on climate action and resource efficiency. And Menotti, that will come, is managing editor of Aspini Online and is also deputy director of the paper edition of Aspini and senior advisor international activities of Anspe Institute Italia. In 2001, Hillary Clinton, while she was Secretary of State of the United States, told we need to create a world in which access to networks and information brings people closer together and expands our definition of community. That was a very wise idea, but new technology didn't give to the world just wonderful opportunities, but also they create new risks, and we will talk about this in this meeting, because we know that a drone can be used to transfer medicines in drugs in an isolated area to heal people, but at the same time it can be used also for violate the privacy of citizens or to control the right of demonstrate on the road or in the squares of some countries, peoples that would have the right to do it, but they live in a country in which this is forbidden. So, as many of you know, not all internet users are aware of it. If a social network adopts algorithms to define the news preferred of preferred interest of the user, the posts that can be viewed by a user in line are in line with that person's interests and opinions. So this can create what Heli Pariser in 2011 defined the filter bubble. And in another book, which is interesting if you're studying this subject, Disinformation and Hate Speech, two Italian authors that were Giovanni Pitruzzella and Oreste Pollicino wrote that when individuals are closed in self-referential bubbles and fake news and hate speech proliferate, politics tend to become more polarized. It's something that you can see in our times, in our country, in Italy, about the so-called Green Pass. And the idea is not that we are, what we are pushed to do is not to exchange our ideas and to create a common sense built on the dialogue, but to have a fight between favorable and people who are against something. And this is not very wise for the state of health of the democracy. And in this case, we have especially students of Tor Vergata with us, studying on global governance, and I can have offered to them a sort of revenge. So we will put questions to professors, and we will ask them to elaborate on what they studied and wrote. Professor Richman wrote an article recently with Francis Fukuyama, a name that maybe you already know, and Ashish Goel. They wrote on Foreign Affairs an article that suggested the title of our meeting, How to Save Democracy from Technology. Professor Richman, you wrote, once a company such as Amazon or Google has amassed data of hundreds of millions of users, it can move into completely new markets and beat established firms that lack similar knowledge. And this is a part of the problem. But you wrote also, internet platforms' real danger is not they distort markets, is that they threaten democracy. Can you please explain us why and how you have this perception? How do they threaten democracy?
Of course. So first of all, let me just thank everybody for joining us, and I especially appreciate the invitation from the festival. It's a real honor to be a part of this conversation. When we say that the dominant platforms threaten democracy, I think we're saying two things. Number one, there are particular platforms, in particular Facebook, Google, maybe Amazon also, that have amassed enormous power and have become intermediaries of information, unlike anything we've ever seen. And these are private accumulations of power. These are not parts of a government. These are not subject to any kind of political accountability. These are new entities that are part of the information ecosystem that just control enormous connectivity. They have enormous amounts of persuasive power over the flow of information. And the second thing we're saying is that we really don't know how they're using that power. They are not just conduits between willing parties who want to participate in a conversation with each other. They control the flow of information. They have algorithms that facilitate what people hear and facilitate what kinds of voices are heard. And in that sense, these intermediaries, these internet platforms, have enormous power to control public discourse, in particular public discourse that affects elections. And if a couple individuals, private individuals, have the ability to shape public discourse and therefore have the ability to affect the outcome of elections, that is almost by definition a threat to democracy. So we approach this problem, I would say, less from the perspective of whether social networks create bubbles, whether they encourage extreme elements of our polity to find each other. That is less our concern. What our concern is whether private companies have the capacity to shape widespread discourse, shape the political or the policy priorities that that the electorate encounters before an election, and therefore can shape the outcome of elections. That's something that I don't think we've really seen before, and that's how that's the problem that we articulate when we say that these platforms can threaten democracy.
Thank you very much. I would ask to Costanza Schubert-Caniglia to explain us what we don't see while we are using social networks as internet about the disinformation. We heard a lot about fake news. Disinformation is not just fake news. It usually is a strategy made by professional people who try to drive our attention in a direction or in another and to build the consensus to some political position, usually position or also not about politics, that have the purpose to divide society and the cohesion of societies. Of course, we know that it exists, but not always we can recognize it. And this phenomenon regards also our country, Italy, not just the United States. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the festival, diplomacy. This one?
Sorry.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes, thank you for the question, and it really is a pleasure to be here again at the Festival of Diplomacy, so thank you for that. Yes, so first of all, I'm going to say we don't like the term fake news that much because it's itself a propaganda term. It's a term
I do agree.
that it's a term that is used to kind of clump together a series of things, and that it was used for political purposes, for propaganda purposes, against traditional media, especially. And I'm saying this just to say we should think about the information ecosystem at large, not just social media, but also traditional media and how they interact on the platforms as well. And so we say there's an information disease. There is an issue of the information ecosystem basically has this new big, both platforms and players at the same time that have entered kind of a space and have, as the professor was saying, the enormous power to shape the conversation. Sometimes without even fully knowing themselves how they're shaping it, because the algorithm has a machine learning component that the platforms themselves sometimes don't know how it goes. So to go back to this information, what we should say is there are different reasons why people might want to manipulate information. And when we talk about this information is false or misleading information, so it can be true information that is shared with the purpose of misleading. There can be different reasons. We have been talking for a long time about foreign countries trying to intervene on a state. This is a concern, but it's not the only one. There are, in fact, there is more and more evidence of domestic disinformation. It can be mainly for two different reasons. Either it's for political purposes or for economic purposes, because disinformation is also extremely profitable. So for the disinformation for political purposes, sometimes it's to convince about something, convince of something, and sometimes is just to sow distrust, right? So to, confuse people so much that they don't know who to believe, and just, decrease the trust into the institutions and other political figures in democracy in general. Some actors have a specific interest into decreasing the trust in democracy. But on the other side, I want to say there is a lot of disinformation that is spread with economic reasons, and more. Disinformation for hire, so private companies that are hired to create a campaign, to spread a campaign, are very common. And I think this is important also because they are detrimental for democracy, especially during elections. But the reason and the motivation is not just political.
Thank you very much. And I would like to know how many people of your age know what Costanza told us. And Roberto Menotti can help us to to have a deeper comprehension of the phenomenon, because he wrote a book which title is Decidere come le società liberali affrontano la complessità, deciding how liberal societies deal with complexities. And he wrote about recent studies that are trying to analyze our times. And you wrote some recurring concepts are, for example, the lack of recognized leadership, that American, that of the West, that of the large international organization, the end of great ideologies, or even no man's world in the expression of Charles Kupchan, which simply lacks any ordering principle. In this case, the confusion that Costanza Sciubba-Caniglia was talking about is very appropriate. And you had that even perception time has been altered with his own compression. Everything, it seems to be happening now in what Douglas Rushkoff has defined continuous present. What kind of risks are we running into in this frame?
Thank you very much, and thanks. Is it working? Yeah. Thanks to the organizers, of course. Thanks for the question, and for the quote, in fact, translated from the Italian, so doubly grateful. I think one of the issues that we sometimes forget is that as we talk about technologies and their impact on democratic discourse and democratic institutions and so on, we are also facing a number of major changes across the board. In a way, the world is changing very quickly, more quickly than even recently was the case. So that, to some extent, increases the sense of confusion. And the fact that people are disoriented by what happens is, to some extent, understandable, even without the impact that has just been described. So it's even worse than that, from one perspective. So there are objective reasons why we are a bit confused, because the world is changing. And political institutions are especially in danger, challenged somehow in this respect, because by definition, especially democratic institutions require the passage of time. They are based on being predictable, on being stable, on ensuring that people know what will happen tomorrow, because there are procedures set in whatever, constitutions or other forms of legal systems. I also think that we sometimes forget how political leaders are co-responsible for what happens. I mean, they exploit these things. They're not passive actors here. And I was struck, I reread a couple of days ago a quote, well, it was quoted as saying, in this case, Abe Lincoln, because social networks were not there at the time. Apparently, the night before the very famous Gettysburg Address in 1863, he was requested to speak, but this was the night before, impromptu. And he, again, is quoted as having said, I don't want to make a fool of myself, because I have not prepared a speech for tonight. So I will better stay silent. Now, this was the President of the United States. Okay, can you imagine any political leader at any level saying something, no, I'll stay silent these days? So this, to me, is where everything converges. There's this confluence of having the means to speak constantly, to tweet constantly, whatever, to be present in the perception of your voters or potential voters or even your opponents, and the fact that political leaders tend to speak a lot. So that's where everything happens. Just to add one point to this, where all of this could be taking us, in a way there's a big temptation here. Political leaders exploit the means, the instruments. The instruments, of course, are not passive themselves, because these are led by people with their own objectives, sometimes totally unrelated to democracy, which is legitimate but needs to be somehow, taken into consideration, let's put it this way. But there's also the fact that the public needs to become a bit more aware of what goes on. And this is an issue of education, I would say. There's no way out. Because unless you know what's going on, you being whatever, the voter, the user, the consumer, will actually be exploited quite easily. To the extent that we become slightly more aware, step by step, of what can happen, I think the situation can actually improve. Otherwise, the danger is we will tend to go with a leader that oversimplifies. And that is always a danger, because if an issue is complex and you want to make it very simple, usually there's something wrong. So that's a danger we know very well. Essentially, the worst kinds of populism are based on that kind of process. And of course, these instruments, these tools help a lot, because they exploit the biases, the shortcuts that we all use, the mental shortcuts.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And to Alexia Massacant, I would ask, looking from the upper level you are, the mountains, or help us to see something that we cannot easily recognize. How can be spied, controlled by the new technologies more than what we know? How can they influence our life, knowing something that sometimes also ourselves don't know about us?
Thank you. Thank you, Maurizio. Indeed, I believe this is a very essential question. I mean, the way we are being monitored right now and how this might evolve in the future. And I will base that partly on my experience working with the Google and the Apple of this world. So I'd like to talk about people primarily. I mean, you, me, the way in which we behave in our daily lives, what we enjoy doing. Most of the time we do that because we want to. So maybe we will monitor our heart rate, or we will watch anything on TV, or browse on the internet. And as we know, everything we do is being registered, recorded, etc., stored as big data for post computation, analysis, etc. So that's what's happening now. If we try to think of what might happen in the future, and also in connection with the whole COVID, post-COVID, I would like to say, although I'm not quite sure about that yet, how this might evolve. This is, by the way, a thesis that the philosopher Yuval Harari has been developing and articulating very nicely. But this is this idea that sooner or later, technology will be able to monitor ourselves in a way which could make anyone owning the data know us better than ourselves. In other words, this is about hacking the human mind in a way, which can be a very disturbing idea. And this comes from the merger, in a way, of computer science on the one hand and biological science on the other, which you end up merging in the form of biometrics. I mean, if you have a watch, maybe monitoring your heart rate, monitoring the number of hours that you sleep at night.
Your steps.
Your steps, exactly. Keeping you fit, and so you think. So this is the tip of the iceberg, if you like. The iceberg itself could be maybe trying to imagine that sooner or later, the computer that you'll be able to buy on the market will have some built-in functionalities that will automatically detect your facial expressions as you're watching the screen of your computer or your TV, for that matter. So it's not only about knowing what you're watching, it's about knowing how you feel about your watching. And that's opening a backdoor first to manipulation, I mean, unconscious manipulation for that matter, and a very disturbing fact and ideas. So I guess this is maybe something we may want to think about, and I mean, finding safeguards for those kind of potential evolution might not be the easiest thing for now, but maybe the kind of evolution that we may want to discuss today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexia. Professor Richman, you wrote, although there is an emerging consensus about the threat that the big tech companies pose to democracy, there is little agreement about how to respond. Some have argued that the government needs to break up Facebook and Google. Others have called for more stringent regulations to limit these companies' exploitation of data, the ones that Roberto Menotti was saying. Without a clear way forward, many critics have defaulted. I was reading, but many critics have defaulted to pressuring platforms to self-regulate, encouraging them to take down dangerous content and do a better job if curating the material carried on their sites. Which is the one that you consider the right way to face this problem?
So, so we approach the solution or the correct policy intervention through the lens of what we think the biggest problem is. And to be sure, and I I want to embrace everything that the other panelists have said, and I think that I want to give kudos, give credit to you for assembling the variety of perspectives that we have here. But the particular problem that we focus on is the ability of private companies, private individuals, to shape public discourse. And in that sense, there are at least two things at work. One is the sheer size of these companies, and there have been calls to break up Facebook and break up Google. We think that in addition to being politically very challenging, we also think that would probably not be an effective solution because, of course, there are natural economies to platforms. The bigger the platform is, the more utility it generates, the more people it can unite. And if we were to break up, say, Facebook into 10 pieces, it's likely that one of the pieces will become the next Facebook and will again dominate the marketplace. We think there's a natural tendency towards monopoly in a lot of these markets. So breaking up any of these companies as an effort to reduce their power, we think is a short-sighted strategy. Instead, what we think we should do is control or limit their ability to control discourse, and that's the algorithms themselves. If Mark Zuckerberg is creating one algorithm that's controlling what people see, that itself is the problem, not so much the problem that everybody logs on to Facebook. So we encourage it would be a policy intervention, but it really would be a policy intervention to invite the marketplace, the private marketplace, to offer consumers, users of Facebook, users of YouTube or Google or users of Twitter, the opportunity to incorporate into the platforms their own algorithm. And if individuals can choose their own algorithm, there is no one person controlling an algorithm that controls what everybody sees. And that directly limits the kind of power that we're really concerned about. Now, and maybe I should stop there. That really is what we are focused on. We want to control, we want to allow individuals to control the algorithms that affect what they see. We want to remove the power of one individual or one company to insert one algorithm that controls what everybody sees. Now, there are a lot of other possible interventions. Some of them were suggested by the fellow panelists. There have been a lot of interventions that have been proposed by privacy advocates, concerned that the ultimate concern is that these platforms know too much about us. And if we limit what they know, that would limit their power. Some people have said that, as we suggested, that there is a need to force the platforms to regulate themselves more. If they regulate themselves more, if they control or address disinformation or harmful information, that might limit the kind of social harms they cause. We think there are problems with these approaches, even though there are also benefits to them as well. We are concerned that a lot of privacy interventions will not limit their power, but actually increase their power, the power of the platforms. We are concerned that asking the platforms to control disinformation themselves makes them more powerful. It gives them more control over what we see and what we hear. And therefore, we are really struggling with a very difficult problem because, again, as one of the panelists said, these are very, very modern and unprecedented kinds of challenges in the digital world. We think, again, that the real source of private power is the algorithm. And that's something that we can curtail. But we don't pretend that that solves all of our problems.
Yes, to solve all the problems is impossible, of course. And we have to observe also that in the Menotti's book, there are some reasons of optimism. Roberto, you write that information follows evolutionary and complex paths. So controlling it in an open society is like riding a tiger. Your opinion is that platforms and users co-evolve. So despite the apparent overwhelming force of the quasi-monopolies who manage the platforms, there is an inevitable critical mass of users who bind them and ultimately determine commercial successes and failures with their own behavior. There is something similar to what Professor Richmond was saying. Are you sure that we can trust on our abilities so much compared to those of the digital giants and their strategies to win our attention?
Well, I think, yes, I'm quite optimistic in this sense, for some of the reasons that the professor, the previous speakers just mentioned, that one way is to use competition in the market to our advantage, right? I mean, in a way, the multiple algorithm solution goes in that direction. And it's one way. The other is probably what I mentioned earlier. It's a bit naive to think that everybody will be really aware of how these things work, but at least having a sense of, you know, there's a lot of confusion out there, be careful, is a little bit like, you know, crossing the street. You are taught to be careful when you're very young. You don't know exactly how a car works, but you will be careful anyway. You don't have to, you don't need to understand, to be an engineer, to know that a car can be dangerous to you. Now, something similar, in that sense, I'm thinking co-evolution, because the users evolve. And they're also producer, by the way, in many ways, think YouTube and all the rest. One other reason why I'm somewhat more optimistic than the average, let's say, is that, I don't want to exaggerate, is that I've never believed very much in golden age theories. Let's put it this way. Let me explain. Sometimes I was reading a book by Giovanni Sartori, who's a very famous Italian political scientist, especially on democracy, by the way. And he was overly critical of TV, of the impact of television, traditional TV channels in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s, all the way, for the same reasons that we would now apply to social networks, because they make the user, the viewer, completely passive and essentially stupid and unaware of what goes on. Then I was also rereading something about the supposedly golden age era of mass political parties. Well, that was pure propaganda in some ways, and people would vote somehow in a way or another because their parents voted that way, or because, you know, whatever, their local church leaders would tell them to do so. So we should be somewhat cautious when we idealize the past, so to say. So we have these new problems, no doubt, but I think sometimes confusion can be used to our advantage, let's say. A little bit of confusion. Let's say multiple sources can be a good thing. The last point, I wanted to go back very quickly to the, let's say, the Facebook question. I'm oversimplifying here. The idea that these giants need to be somehow put under control. I was struck by I think it was in 2019, by the very famous congressional hearing when Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was questioning Mark Zuckerberg, you know, live TV with a lot of attention, media attention and all that. And I eventually, slowly, gradually came to the point where I was actually sympathizing with him. She was very aggressive. She was very effective, very aggressive. At some point, she also mentioned the fact that Facebook was, to some extent, expected to define what is a lie and what is a truth. And that is something that I would never want Facebook to decide. Okay, fact-checking is something, but it's very different when you start saying, you know, would you post a lie? Well, I don't know. Where exactly is the boundary between a lie and something that is an opinion? So maybe we should also think about turning some of these, or treating some of these platforms as publishers with, you know, all the related, you know, obligations and rights as publishers, not as platforms. Meaning that they should be co-responsible in terms of what they post. So fact-checking, yes. The Ministry of the Truth, I would leave to George Orwell. That's a bit worrisome to me. In that sense, we should be careful when the remedy is worse than the disease.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roberto. Costanza, no one can have the whole solution of the whole problem. But what do you suggest to be done for this fight against enemies that people can see? What could European Union and journalists do to make people aware of the possibility to be diverted in their opinions and choices about politics or about products?
Thank you. And there's so much to say about this, and so many fascinating ideas from the previous speakers. So I will, try to give something to the debate, but I would like also to discuss those ideas, hopefully in the question time, to the users being able to decide the algorithm is one. That is really fascinating. But anyway, on this, I think the problem is obviously very complex, and it cannot be solved with easy solutions, which also means it cannot be solved by a single actor. And this is not a problem that will be solved by the platforms, by the government, by civil society, by journalism, but it really requires a whole of the government on one side and whole of society on the other side type of solution. And so the solutions are multiple. On one side, and on this I want to say, we have seen a change in the posture of the platforms in recognizing their responsibility. In the past couple of years, and I'm saying, the platform as a, catch them all term, obviously there are big differences between them, but let's say, I think most of them have recognized that there is an issue, and they are increasing self-regulation. What will be needed from the platform point of view, it's increased transparency, especially on the algorithm. Because as of now, we really don't have this much insight. We have, a sense, but it's like having a black box. We know what comes out, and we can study what comes out and kind of imagine how it is created, but we don't know exactly how it works. So transparency is first, and especially when we're talking about elections. So especially during those times, there needs to be increased transparency and increased cooperation with the governments. From the government point of view, and you mentioned the European Union, the DSA, the Digital Service Act, it's an extremely good first step. It's not the only first step that the European Union has done. There is more cooperation with the platforms as well. It has been going on for the past couple of years, which is very, very good. And there are more resources created for civil society, for education. You were mentioning the users will learn. So we need media literacy. This translates to me into we need more media literacy. We need, the society as a whole went from a certain type of information ecosystem to a completely different one, and needs to learn about it, right? So we need this. And it is true, though, that every new technology always goes through, this kind of, oh, the world is ending, we're doomed. And then, kind of we figure it out. And from the journalism point of view, many research found out that disinformation, can be spread on social media, and the big influencers are more and more the ones that push it. But until the traditional media don't pick it up and reshare it, it doesn't really have that big of an impact. So it is important that traditional media really first understands the functioning and the problem and how it works, and then it learns also what are the strategies and the techniques that are used by disinformation groups, by disinformation actors, to know how to respond and really change. There are many, different type of things that media can do in their reporting to really, address this and avoid amplifying disinformation, which is a huge issue.
Thank you, Costanza. I would like to tell to the students, if they don't already know it, that there is a kind of newsletter that the European Union makes, and is the EU East Stratcom Task Force that write it. And if you want, you can sign yourself and receive it, and you will you can read informations about disinformation that is produced daily by our neighbors, neighbors of the European Union, particularly coming from East. And they're interesting because you will find the raw product of the disinformation and the explanation of the ingredients and the materials that are inside. Alexia Massagan, you talked about before the top of iceberg of the risks we are talking about. Can you explain how the digital tools you are developing or that you are studying can monitor governments or other powers, other kinds of powers like the economic powers?
So, in fact, I'd like to give you a very, very concrete example of how this can work, and which may be part of the hope in the whole debate. So, I just have basically 2 slides, and what you're going to see. Well, it should have been a very short video. It's not going to be, unfortunately. So I'll just describe what you should be seeing. So the huge piece of rock that you see on the screen is just about to fall down downstream into the valley. And this event is one of many events that are taking place more and more in the Alps. This one took place in Switzerland in 2017. And this is an illustration of what citizens have to face more and more in terms of hazards in connection to climate change. And on that point, the tool, the digital platform that we have developed is really an empowerment platform. It's about citizen science. And it's basically giving you, again, people, the chance to observe what's happening around you. Happens in a few seconds on your smartphone. You can take a picture, make a comment. Everything is geolocalized, and it's in real time online for everyone to see. And examples of what we can monitor in this way, or I'll give you 2 examples of major hazards. One are glacial lakes. You might have heard that in the Himalaya primarily, but also now in the Alps as well and everywhere else, glaciers are melting as the temperature is slowly rising, creating lakes, as you can see on the top of on the top picture. And you know, the picture is beautiful and it's all fine as long as the moraine and the rocks around it can sustain the weight of the water. But if all of a sudden the lake starts bursting out and flows down into a valley, it can create huge damage. And this is what has been happening in the past years, more and more often in the Himalaya. And you can imagine that those communities are not necessarily well equipped to deal with this damage and to try, even to prevent or to be alerted about a possible risk to start with. Another type more familiar with us here in Europe are the rock falls and the ice avalanches. You might have heard, I don't know if you like mountains, but if you ever go to the Mont Blanc area, now every summer they have to evacuate entire villages because of the risk of huge ice pieces, what we call sérac in the mountain language, that can basically collapse into the valley, putting at risk entire populations. And with technology has really enabled people to monitor risk in the mountains in an unprecedented way, because as you go around mountains, you take that picture that can be shared, and then that will directly inform authorities of what's happening. And once authorities are informed, if they do not act in terms of disaster prevention or to protect their populations, they can be held accountable for the damage down the road. So that's really the message here that I'd like to convey. And I'm giving the mountain example, but the technology which is in the platform can be applied to any topic, whether related to the environment or whether it related to energy in terms of any leakage that can take place from a pipe. Should it be water? Should it be oil? I mean, you can use those technologies to really track governments, authorities, whatever they do, private companies as well, and they can be extremely powerful. So that's the message I'd like to convey here. And we were talking about potential solutions. I agree that it's probably a cocktail and a combination that can really help as quickly as we can, because pace will probably be critical in trying to support democracy. But government regulations, on the one hand, tools such as this one, really to empower citizens. And the third aspect that I'd like to mention, and since we have students here, it might be very interesting to have their opinion, would also be the role that ethical education could play, that as students study computer science or any subject, that to sensitize those students to the potential consequences of the choices that they may have to make in their working lives in the current context could really be a key to a better future, I believe. Thanks.
Thank you. Just a short question about the continuous present that Shrashkov and Menotti were writing about. How can you be sure that the picture or the video that a user sent to you about the risks and the dangers of the bounty is true? Do you have a filter? Do you control it?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Quality control is central and integral to the platform, and so we have various levels of checks, and include the most important one being by the admin team itself, yeah, which is checking really the relevance of the.
So there is a procedure to avoid that you are misleaded.
Exactly, that the platform is not spammed, that's it's admin, and we actually also call on citizens to cross-check the observations. So there are really different levels, but you're absolutely right that it's essential.
I think it's very important. It's very important to know it, because otherwise we are creating other channels in which the people who want to drive our attention in the wrong way can do it.
That's right.
Thank you very much. I would say that we have time. For 4 very telegraphic questions, and if someone would like, there is a girl there. Yes, you could do it. If you can come here, maybe, or you have a microphone. Yes, perfect.
I have the mic.
Thanks a lot.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the discussions that we have. My name is Beatriz. I come from Brazil. I'm a second-year student of global governance. And my question is to develop a bit more the story of the algorithms, that we can have the power to choose our own algorithms. If you could develop it a bit more, because in my view, we have to use this in a certain careful way, because I believe that by giving the choice to the users to choose their own algorithms, that might even actually deepen the divisions that we have in our social platforms nowadays. Thank you.
I'd say, Professor Richman, if you want, you could give the answer.
I'd be delighted to, but I couldn't hear the question. Could you paraphrase it for me?
Beatriz, can you?
Hello, Professor. My question is about the choice of the users to decide their algorithms, because in my opinion, that actually might deepen the divisions that we have inside of the social platforms. I don't see exactly as an option for us to fulfill this gap that the algorithms chosen by the social platforms might cause to us. Thank you.
In other terms, that democracy without limits and without rules can be a damage for democracy itself.
And I guess technology that's not understood could be an even worse problem than technology that is controlled. So the one theme that I want to emphasize that's coming out, I think, from many of the speakers up here, is that because of the complexity of the underlying technologies and because of the fragility, I guess, the fragility of human beings, the way human beings are vulnerable to both misinformation and emotional manipulation, it's very difficult to come up with a set of rules from any one individual polity to control the underlying problems. I think that there is a common voice, a common theme that's coming out of all of the speakers, which is that we need market solutions and we need technological solutions. The furtherance of technology and the creativity of the marketplace are better counters to dominant platforms than any kind of regulatory response. But that does not mean that consumers are left on their own. What we really need are, what we propose in particular are additional intermediaries, people that provide middleware, something that comes between the user and the platform that allows the individual not only to understand and curtail the platform better, but also to express their own views. So we would not require platforms to give consumers the ability to create their own algorithm. That really is asking consumers to do too much. What we are asking is for platforms to open up their APIs so other intermediaries can come in and offer consumers to insert those algorithms. And we would rely on the institutions that we trust, our civic institutions, whether that's our school boards, our universities, our churches, our political parties, our trusted proxies would be able to construct their own algorithms. And this shouldn't be terribly complicated if the APIs are opened up. So if you like a particular news source, if you like a particular civic organization, you would very easily be able to use them and download from their site onto your Twitter platform, onto your Facebook platform, the algorithm that they design. So what we would have is we would have a technological solution to a technological problem. This would open up a diversity of ideas and a diversity of sources of control, loci of control of the algorithms. And it would also allow individuals to return to institutions that they trust. And we think ultimately that the way to maintain civic discourse is to promote the kind of civic trust we have in our civic institutions.
Thank you very much. There is another question? Yep. Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Paolo, a second-year global governance student from the University of Tor Vergata. I had a question regarding a concept that Mrs. Caniglia had expressed in her speech about the distinction of misinformation in the policy ambit and the economic one. So in particular about this last one, how misinformation, can be, it is used in the economic fields and if it has to deal something with manipulation also. So manipulation of information and therefore with the choice of the consumer. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So some examples.
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I think it's an important one. I think we understand, political manipulation better. Why is it important? But economic manipulation, I want to say again, or manipulation with an economic intent, disinformation is very profitable. It's profitable for the platforms because it's, the platforms have their goal is to keep you on the platform as much as possible. And because basically they are advertising platforms, really. That's their business, right? So they want to keep you on the platform as much as possible. And this information is, generally speaking, a type of information, type of content that is very, very attractive and will keep you on the platform. And so there is that component. And so that's important to me to say, because there is a misaligned incentives between democracy and public discourse and what we think it's important as citizens and what the business model itself. But for the actors, what is profitable is like, I want to make an example. We have and I say we, with the HKS Misinformation Review and Lewis University, we conducted 2 studies on disinformation communities in Italy, one on QAnon and the other one is on anti-vax. And so, for example, one of the ways that the anti-vax make money out of this information is very, very often they drive traffic from Facebook on their own websites. And so that's already a way that they make money, just through the ads. And then they also sell a lot of stuff. So they sell products, any kind of products, including medical products and therapies. There is a home therapy system, and so that's another way. They also make money as influencers make money because they can become very, very big influencers. So there's another, advertising, sponsorizations, all type of things. And then finally, the disinformation for hire firms are basically PR firms, consultants that you can hire to, spread whatever type of misleading information you are interested into.
Thank you. So no green pass, but okay to hidden sellers and shops. And there is another question.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today with us. Today, so my question, I'm Valerio Nejumi from Tor Vergata University of Rome, second year global governance student. So my question regards legislation, and it's about how much is law allowed to bind, limit, intervene in the relations between individuals in private space, so the social media that are created by private companies. So this is the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to say something. It's not a reply. I mean, it's not a general reply, let's say. It seems to me that the question is very legitimate. That's why I mentioned earlier the fact that I thought George Orwell when I, listened to that hearing, and especially the attitude that some politicians are beginning to take, which is essentially they would like to instinctively force the platforms to become the enforcers of rules that are not yet even that clear to the legislators themselves, in part because they don't understand the platforms. So it's a dangerous situation, because one of the other things that I got out of that hearing, for example, and many others of the same type, is that clearly the legislators have a major problem with understanding what's going on, which is fair, because these are new things, and there's also a generational issue, especially the older legislators and Congress people simply don't have a clue. And so clearly someone like Mark Zuckerberg and many others would simply, let's say, circumvent the questions, and so legislating becomes extremely tricky, because you may be misled, and how can you regulate something you don't understand? It's not easy. It reminds me of some of the debates we've been having over the past few years with finance, fintech, especially the most highly developed, sophisticated financial issues. I mean, very few people understand exactly how those things work. And most of these people do not want you to understand how it works. right? Because that's the way they make the money. We know, especially think 2008, you know, the big bubble, the big crisis, and so on. And that's still the same way after more than 10 years, but we still have to regulate some of these things. So what you do, you try to usually adopt something like a precautionary principle. You know, you're not sure whether something is a danger, then you tend to protect the consumer, even maybe overprotect the consumer. So these are the ways that we usually go about when something is new. In this case, in the specific case of digital technologies, I think there's also something that, that's why I said we shouldn't over-regulate. And I was very much in agreement with what has been said earlier, that market solutions should be our first choice, whenever that's possible. It will not be enough, it will never be enough, because markets, of course, do not self-regulate, we know that. But to the extent that that's possible, it's better to use competition against itself, so to say, well, against the big ones. For example, new ideas, new business models and so on continue to emerge, and their main goal is to kill the old ones, the big ones of today. So some of that will happen anyway, and we can make use of that even to regulate and legislate. But one last point, sometimes I'm also a bit worried that we forget that a lot of this is driven by our instincts, by very, very human instincts. For example, the fact of you know, these cognitive bubbles, it's simply because usually these bubbles are very effective, are very useful to our you know, daily life. There's nothing wrong with that, and we cannot regulate the bubbles, because I tend to believe what I like to believe, and no regulator will ever make me change my mind by force of law, okay? But at the same time, you have to make sure that doesn't destroy liberal democracy and the markets, incidentally, both.
There is time for a very fast question to Alexia.
Excuse me, Mr. Okay.
Oh?
I'm sorry. I thought that there was another question, but...
There is another question? There is time for another one? Yeah. Very fastly.
Time? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shanae Wilson. I'm from South Africa, and I'm a student at Tor Vergata. And my question has to do with something that Professor Richman mentioned earlier about, he mentioned this example of Facebook and how people were considering to break up Facebook into smaller parts, but obviously that's a short-term solution. And with that example, and also now with this whole need to want to control algorithms, I was wondering if you think that this isn't maybe a threat to democratic and free market ideas, that you, as a person with an idea, believe in your idea, you can get a loan from a bank, take a major financial risk to start a business, and this business sort of just decides to grow according to how, well, for instance, in the example of Facebook, how users wanted it to grow. I mean, if users didn't want to use Facebook, then Facebook wouldn't have become as big as it did. So isn't this a bit of a threat to the idea that you could want to start a business and it should get as big as it can possibly get, because of the fact that these same people that you're worried about being manipulated are the same people that are making this platform as big as it is at the end of the day?
Professor Richman?
I might, again, it's more a matter of the microphones. I might ask one of the panelists just to use one of their microphones to paraphrase a question for me. Could I ask that?
Do it again.
No. Actually,
No,
it's the microphone. So maybe one of the 4 or 5 of you could just paraphrase for me.
I think the question was, especially the last part of the question, I especially liked. So I'll summarize that part, which was those who make these platforms as big and as effective and as powerful as they are the same people who are manipulated by the platforms. There's a kind of catch-22 situation here, because, you know, I think that's the fundamental issue. So how do we get out of that bind? Because I, as a user, am making them as powerful as they are. Then there was another part, but okay.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and it's not just that they are manipulated by it, but they also, in large part, don't understand what it is that they're creating. These are large and very complicated companies, and to some degree, what Google does on one side of its company doesn't know what the other side is doing as well. The people who do search don't know what the people who do maps and biometrics do. The most immediate conclusion from that is that it's impossible. I think this was just said previously. It's impossible to expect a regulator to know what the company does better than what the company knows itself. And I also think that genuinely, although Mark Zuckerberg for sure is trying to maximize his revenue, I also believe that he thinks that Facebook is bringing good things to the world. I mean, we don't want to excessively malign what these company leaders are doing, or at least the intentions of what we don't want to excessively malign their intentions. I therefore think that the best approach really is to try to see how we can bring more competition to the marketplace. That I do think that more competition, more substitutes for Facebook or Google would both mean more transparency, a better understanding of what exactly is happening behind the veil of the algorithms. I also think that it will allow us to bring more, let's put it this way, more competition for the ethics of cyberspace. We want to be able to offer more privacy choices to, say, search and to Facebook, as opposed to requiring Facebook and Google themselves to adhere to certain privacy regimens. I mean, this is a technology that or it's not even tech. I mean, there are multiple technologies. This is an ecosystem that we are all trying to get our heads around. And just like there, I think, are great needs for some kind of policy intervention, there's also a great danger of reacting too rashly. And I therefore think that the more engagement there is from other technologists, and the more tools there are, such as tools that can monitor what the platforms are doing and tools that allow us to really control what we do with the platforms, I think those are the best solutions. They might be incremental solutions, but they would be solutions that would at least curtail the worst abuses and also allow better products to enter the marketplace, not only better products that that would offer meaningful competition to the marketplace, but also better products that would offer more control to our polities.
Thank you very much, Richmond. And we have, let's say, Masakan, who has just two
I can't
things to say.
resist, sorry.
Yeah.
Two short remarks, and I would have liked them to be questions, but we have no time. In connection to competition, obviously I would agree that this, when it works, it's very efficient. In the context of big tech companies, however, well, it seems many continents and countries are struggling. I mean, the European Union has been trying for a while now with not much luck. So that would be, I mean, how far can we go with competition when it comes to the well-established big tech companies? And the second one relates to the training data which is needed to develop the algorithms. One thing we are seeing as well is that those big tech companies tend to confiscate, to a large extent, this training data. So the idea of developing algorithms would be great, but will those entities wanting to develop those new algorithms be able to access this training data? Would have been my question. Thanks.
So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to a student that is in the last bench, which is the founder and Secretary General of the Festival of the Democrazia, Giorgio Bartolomucci, and to the personnel of the festival and of the representative of the European Commission in Rome to hosting this debate, and to our guests, to Alexia Massacant, Costanza Sciubba-Caniglia, and Roberto Menotti, and Professor Richman. And I would say that Professor Richman talked about the fragility of human beings. I think we have to remember that we are fragile and to study also, to defend ourselves and to spread the awareness of the riskness and not just of the opportunities of these technologies. And I think it's very convenient, and it will be not convenient to avoid to do it. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.